Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 4.5, A New Dawn. At the end of last week's episode, we covered the surrender of the final German holdout at the Schlacht Denkmal, and as a result, the city of Leipzig was now formally under complete American control. But whilst the Battle of Leipzig was over, the aftermath of the fighting would present a whole new set of challenges for both the people of Leipzig and their new American occupiers. Leipzig was reeling from the effects of a long catastrophic war, and the fighting over the past few days had only compounded the level of devastation and chaos in the city. Dead German soldiers and civilians could be found all over Leipzig. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruin, and much of the city's infrastructure had been destroyed. To analyze the impact of the battle, let's first consider the number of people who were killed or wounded during the fighting. On the German side, it's estimated that up to 200 Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe personnel, Volkssturm fighters, Hitler Youth boys, and civilians were killed during the 3 days of fighting in Leipzig. However, these estimates typically account only for German deaths which happened within the city limits. Thus, they fail to take into account the deaths which took place on the outskirts of Leipzig. Plus, this often quoted figure of 200 deaths fails to include the many concentration camp inmates, forced foreign laborers, and political prisoners who were also killed by the SS in the days before the battle and during it. Most notably, the group of 80 inmates who were killed in the Tekla concentration camp. Plus, hundreds of German soldiers had been wounded in the fighting, and many of these soldiers died from their wounds in the days and weeks after the battle. However, their deaths often get missed in the official statistics of the battle. Likewise, for the Americans, early reports after the battle stated that only 20 American soldiers had died during the capture of Leipzig, which helped create a narrative that the battle had been a relatively blood-free exercise, especially when compared to the assault on other major German cities, such as Aachen, where thousands of American servicemen died. However, in reality, when counting the list of fallen, which were reported by the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions during their assault on Leipzig, combined with the losses suffered by the 9th Armored Division and other American forces fighting outside of the city, the campaign to assault and capture Leipzig led to at least 60 to 75 American deaths, with up to 300 American soldiers also being wounded in the process. In any case, compared to our previous series on Berlin, Bautzen, and Haube, it's clear that the human cost of the Battle of Leipzig was certainly lower than in those battles, and the primary reasons for that can be explained by the relatively short duration of the fighting, the active participation of the Leipzig civilian population in disarming German units, and the American military's tactic of favoring combat patrols with infantry rather than large-scale use of highly destructive artillery bombardments. Ultimately, however, the fact that this battle focused on American and German forces fighting each other, rather than German and Soviet forces, is perhaps the strongest factor which explains the lower casualty numbers. In Berlin, Bautzen, and Haube, the German soldiers believed they were fighting for their lives, fearful that if they dared surrender, then the Soviets would kill them, or send them off to a Siberian gulag, where they would die anyway. Such fears help explain why the German forces in those battles were willing to die with a gun in their hand, rather than risk surrendering. In Leipzig, however, the Americans were viewed with far less hatred and fear. So many German soldiers were more willing to surrender than continue fighting. Ultimately, however, hundreds of people did perish in the city, and as soon as the fighting ended on the 20th of April, the task of combing through the destroyed houses and rubble-strewn streets to find the dead began. And indeed, within just a few hours of the final surrender at the Schlacht Denkmal, the first mass burials of German soldiers took place in the grounds of the monument. The 3 days of fighting in the city capped off what had truly been a miserable experience for the people of Leipzig during the war, because in total, almost 6,000 civilians died in Leipzig, predominantly from Allied bombing raids, but also caused in part by the Battle of Leipzig as well. Thankfully, Leipzig had avoided major incidents of house-to-house fighting during the battle, and whilst the German defenders had made ample use of their Panzerfausts, they primarily aimed their rockets at the American tanks, not at the buildings themselves. The civilians of Leipzig also benefited from the fact that the use of heavy artillery had been restricted, as the Americans had been careful not to fire on their own troops. As a final stroke of luck for the people of Leipzig, the key bridges over the Weisse-Elster River, including the vital Zeppelin Bridge, were still standing, meaning that the western districts were not cut off from the rest of the city. However, whilst Leipzig had been spared the total annihilation suffered by other cities such as Berlin, the war-weary people of Leipzig and their new American occupiers still had a hell of a mess on their hands. With Leipzig secure, there was no need for frontline fighting units to remain in the city, so orders came down from US 5th Corps headquarters for the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions to move out. The 69th Infantry Division left Leipzig immediately on the 20th of April, and they continued their advance towards the Mulde and Elbe rivers, where they joined the 9th Armoured Division to await the arrival of Soviet troops in the area. And in fact, just a few days later, it was a patrol from the 273rd Infantry Regiment of the 69th Infantry Division which made the historic first link-up with Soviet troops on the 25th of April, near the town of Torgau along the Elbe River. However, the 23rd Infantry Regiment from the 2nd Infantry Division spent the rest of the 20th of April fraternizing with the women of Leipzig and drinking champagne from looted stores. The next morning, they left the city and also advanced east towards the Mulde River, likely nursing a few epic hangovers. The occupation of Leipzig was therefore handed over to artillery units from the US 5th Corps, and their first objectives were to prevent looting, start the initial clear-up of main thoroughfares, and control the thousands of displaced persons, or DPs, who were moving through the city. These DPs were a truly diverse group, including German refugees from the East, former foreign labourers, freed concentration camp inmates, and Allied prisoners of war. The American military authorities were keen to set up a new administration to govern the city, but the Neues Rathaus town hall had sustained heavy damage during the battle, requiring administrative offices to be relocated to various buildings around the city. Moreover, the lack of working telephone lines the suspension of postal services, and the loss of municipal records, either through air raids or deliberate destruction by the SS and Gestapo, significantly hampered the ability of the American military administration to re-establish governance in Leipzig. Colonel Dan Hill was appointed the first U.S. commander of Leipzig, and he set up his office in the undamaged Leipzig Fire Insurance Company building at Dietrich Ring 24, whilst the rest of the American military authorities worked out of a nearby hotel. 1 week later, the entire American military administration relocated to a more permanent headquarters on Auenstrasse, now known as Hinrichsenstrasse. One of the first issues the U.S. City Commander Colonel Hill had to deal with was the sudden appearance of NKFD members, or the Nationalkomitee Freies Deutschland, who had popped out of the woodwork during the final stages of the battle. This pro-communist organization has featured before in the podcast, particularly in the series on Haube, where they were known as Seydlitz troops. In Leipzig, the organization had remained underground until the moment the Americans captured the city. At that point, the NKFD made themselves known to the American occupiers in an effort to influence the new governors of the city. The Americans, not keen to hand power to the communists, initially offered the post of mayor to the SPD member Erich Zeigner, who had been the minister-president of Saxony during the Weimar Republic. However, Zeigner declined the Americans' offer, citing health reasons. The U.S. military then approached the 55-year-old Dr. Johannes Vierling, who was a well-known lawyer. Vierling ran one of the city's largest law firms, and he had never joined the Nazi Party. In fact, during the Third Reich, Vierling had even made a name for himself defending political dissidents. Numerous industrial and civil leaders in Leipzig recommended Dr. Vierling to the American authorities, so the Americans believed he had the right credentials and the necessary level of widespread support to set up a new civil administration for Leipzig. On the 23rd of April, Vierling was installed as the new mayor of Leipzig, and he led a new advisory council to replace the former Leipzig City Council, which had operated during the Third Reich. Meanwhile, the Leipzig police force was also reformed to help bring order to the streets, and a new police chief was named in the form of Heinrich Fleissner, who had held the position previously between 1923 and 1933, before being deposed by the Nazis. Despite these changes, the American military administration maintained final authority in the city. And whilst Dr. Vierling, in his role as mayor, was allowed to select the new staff of the various municipal offices, these appointments still required American approval. Nevertheless, Vierling and his new advisory council worked tirelessly with the Americans to reintroduce basic services to the people of Leipzig, with the first priority being the re-establishment of food, electricity, and water supplies. Within only a few weeks, the city's utilities were largely operational once again, and repair work had already begun on the roads, bridges, and train lines of Leipzig. Major thoroughfares were cleared of rubble, allowing for movement around the city, and unexploded bombs were defused and removed. This was no simple task because, after the years of Allied bombs and the 3 days of fighting in April 1945, approximately 20% of the city had been destroyed. Across the city, 33,870 apartments had been completely destroyed by Allied bombs, with a further 13,500 being heavily damaged and 80,000 lightly damaged. Overall, 41% of the total housing capacity in Leipzig had been destroyed. Moreover, the cultural heart of the city had been ripped out by Allied bombs, with the gutting of museums, churches, theatres, and the university. The fighting in April 1945 had only exacerbated the destruction of Leipzig, with key areas in the city such as the Neues Rathaus, the Völkerschlacht Denkmal, and the Hauptbahnhof all heavily scarred from the intense sieges which had taken place at these locations. Yes, these buildings still stood, thanks to their strong concrete foundations and thick walls, but their outer facades resembled moon craters, not buildings. Moreover, shrapnel damage and bullet holes were present on almost every house in the city centre, and at key flashpoints such as the Zeppelin Bridge. In the days after the battle, men, women, and children, along with thousands of German prisoners of war, were immediately put to work clearing the streets of rubble, with the piles of broken bricks and stones often filled into road embankments, pits, or one of the estimated 2,500 bomb craters found throughout the city. Overall, it's estimated that Leipzig was covered in almost 5 million cubic meters of rubble, and it would take years for the full cleanup of the damage to be completed, with only 1/3 of the total amount of debris removed by 1948. Some of the solutions for dealing with the rubble were brutally simple. For example, in the south of Leipzig, a large 153-meter artificial hill called the Fockerberg was built entirely out of the rubble. Whilst the Americans were keen to install a new civil administration to get Leipzig back on its feet, this didn't mean that they forgot the crimes of the past. Thus, even with huge sections of the city in pieces, and the burying of the dead still ongoing, the US occupying forces made the hunting of Nazi war criminals a key priority in the days after the battle. These efforts were led by the Army's Counterintelligence Corps. Immediately after capturing the city, the Counterintelligence Corps, supported by the Leipzig Criminal Police Office and members of the communist NKFD, began searching for Nazi officials and alleged war criminals. Throughout the city, American patrols searched for members of the Wehrmacht, SS, SA, and Gestapo, and if they were found, they were arrested. Even civilians such as Professor Otto Resch, who was the director of the university's Institute of Racial and Ethnological Studies, was arrested by the Counterintelligence Corps. Professor Resch was accused of having produced racial ancestry reports, which were used to discriminate and eliminate opponents of the Nazi regime. The Nazis had saturated the civil and social spheres of everyday life. Therefore, in the weeks after the battle, the Americans rifled through the records they had available, rooting out and dismissing all municipal employees and school principals who had been members of the Nazi Party. And as a result, eventually, 1/4 of the city's civil servants, employees, and municipal workers were dismissed due to their membership in the party. Beyond finding and removing active members of the Nazi Party, the Americans also put a great deal of effort into documenting the war crimes they came across in Leipzig, and they prioritized the identification and burial of political prisoners who had been murdered by the Nazis. At the former Tekla concentration camp, the identification and burial of the victims from the massacre on the 18th of April was led by First Lieutenant William G. Frost from the 606th Quartermaster Graves Registration Company. Lieutenant Frost was determined that these victims should be buried with full military honours, and he spent days after the battle searching through Leipzig for a suitable resting place for the victims. Eventually, Lieutenant Frost found a section of unused land in front of a large chapel right in the heart of the Südfriedhof cemetery in the southeast of the city. And on the 26th of April, the American authorities ordered 200 Leipzig civilians to come to the cemetery and dig the graves for the victims of the Tekla camp massacre. Lieutenant Frost informed those civilians that the graves must be dug to his satisfaction, and if that meant working long into the night, then so be it. When the graves were finally dug, the 200 civilians were sent home, and Lieutenant Frost organized a Leipzig police guard to stand watch over the burial site. The next day, on the 27th of April, the victims of the Tekla massacre were given a full burial ceremony, and in order to ensure that the funeral proceeded without incident, the Americans deployed 4 half-tracks to guard the funeral procession, whilst snipers were installed in the chapel tower. The Americans wanted to send a strong message that this funeral was not to be disturbed, for they strongly believed that the victims should receive the honor and respect in death, which had been denied to them in life. In the end, the funeral passed off without incident, and 100 surviving inmates from a nearby concentration camp marched at the front of the procession, carrying the flags of their various nations in a symbolic tribute to the dead. They were followed by the American city commander Colonel Hill and a senior American military entourage, including Lieutenant Frost. After them, 900 German civilians, including city officials and civil society representatives, such as the director of the Leipzig University and the pastor of the St. Thomas Church, followed in silent tribute. Prayers were spoken by representatives of all faiths, and after the service was over, the surviving former concentration camp inmates placed flowers on the coffins. The coffins were then lowered into the graves before civilian workers covered them with earth. The fact that the American military authorities and the newly installed civilian administration of the city went to such great lengths to provide the victims of the Tekla massacre with a dignified burial was an incredible dedication of resources, particularly given the huge amounts of destruction and chaos in the city at the time. Another major challenge facing the American military authorities in Leipzig was how to process and indeed care for the estimated 200,000 displaced persons who were present in the city and the surrounding area. The first task was to provide accommodation, and given the widespread destruction of the city's housing stock during the war, several camps were set up for the displaced persons. These camps were separated by nationality, and all non-Germans were required to report at their respective camps for processing, The goal of the Americans was to document exactly who was in Leipzig and where those people came from, so that repatriation efforts could clear the backlog and get everyone on their way. The camp system was remarkably efficient, and it not only allowed groups to be sent back home to where they came from, it also successfully enabled the transport to the west of those who no longer wished to return home, such as Polish people who didn't want to go back to Poland following the Soviet occupation of the country. Plus, all Allied prisoners of war who had been liberated by the Americans were also prioritized for repatriation. However, whilst the repatriation of foreign labourers and Allied prisoners of war was relatively straightforward, dealing with the influx of German refugees from the East was more difficult. Unlike the foreign nationals, these Germans had nowhere to go, as their former homes now lay hundreds of miles east behind the rapidly descending Iron Curtain. Even if these Germans wanted to go back to their old homes in East Prussia or Silesia, the Red Army wouldn't allow it, and the non-German population living there wouldn't want them back anyway. These German refugees now had to rebuild their lives in cities like Leipzig, where they often had no family or friends, little in the way of possessions and money, and sometimes they even struggled to understand the language, given their own distinct dialects. Between 11 to 18 million ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe were forcibly expelled from their homes at the end of the war, and this massive influx of people led to further pressure on already strained cities such as Leipzig. Given the acute shortage of housing, food, and jobs, the Americans tried to manage the influx of people into Leipzig as best they could. But the disorganized arrival of large groups of refugees, often without warning, was a constant headache for the authorities. And in some cases, it's reported that new arrivals were simply moved on elsewhere. The challenge of accommodating the refugees would continue long after the war. By 1946, the state of Saxony had housed more than 1 million refugees. And by 1948, it was reported that more than 70,000 people living in Leipzig were German refugees from the East, a figure which accounted for just under 15% of the total population of the city. Nevertheless, the displaced persons camps set up by the Americans in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Leipzig were successful in enabling the authorities to manage, process, and repatriate as many displaced persons as they could. And it's estimated that the numbers of displaced persons in Leipzig dropped from 200,000 at the end of April 1945 down to less than 20,000 by August 1945. Despite the challenges of occupation, the Americans were slowly returning some sense of normality and order to the city of Leipzig. On the 30th of April, Colonel Dan Hill moved on with his unit, and he was replaced as U.S. commander in the city by Major Richard Eaton. When Major Eaton arrived in Leipzig, he was shocked by the amount of devastation he saw, and in a letter to his wife, he wrote, "There is hardly a place that has not been destroyed. The destructive power of a vast air force is simply unimaginable. I cannot help but wonder how people will ever recover from the damage to their cities, railroads, and industries. Before handing over power to Major Eaton, Colonel Hill reported that all displaced persons in the city had been put into accommodation and were being taken care of. Moreover, order and security had been re-established. Looting of businesses and homes had stopped, and both the Leipzig police force and the fire service were once again fully operational. Even healthcare services were functioning in the city, under the lead of the American military. Colonel Hill reported that a total of 6,921 prisoners of war were being held captive, and 905 war criminals had been taken prisoner as well, which served as a testament to the American efforts to track down and arrest former party members, SS men, and other such figures affiliated with the Nazi regime. The Hitler Youth had also been dissolved, and there were no reports of any pro-Nazi underground activity either. Most importantly, the new Civil Advisory Board, under the leadership of the Mayor, Dr. Fearling, was working efficiently in unison with the Americans, and all former regime members had been purged from the new civil and municipal authorities. Major Eaton praised the work of the Mayor, Dr. Fearling, arguing that he had succeeded in the Herculean task of making the destroyed and lawless Leipzig livable again. He also stated that Fearling had contributed significantly to helping the city recover. With the immediate post-battle chaos now subsiding, the new military government issued numerous regulations and proclamations for the people of Leipzig. For example, curfews were to be strictly enforced by armed military patrols, whilst the publication of newspapers, the use of cameras, and gatherings of people in the streets and squares of the city were all prohibited. Major Eaton, perhaps mindful of the fragile political situation between the US and their Soviet allies, walked a fine line when administrating Leipzig. For instance, although all political parties were still banned, Major Eaton allowed for some involvement of the communist NKFD in the reorganization of the city administration. But even this peace offering wasn't enough to satisfy the NKFD, who started agitating against the mayor, Dr. Fearling, distributing leaflets around the city, demanding that he be removed from his post as mayor. In another nod to the objective of maintaining friendly relations with the Soviets, Leipzig also hosted meetings between senior American and Soviet commanders, where the partnership between the US and the USSR was celebrated, and their joint efforts in defeating Nazi Germany were commemorated. 2 of these meetings took place in May, and we can presume that these meetings involved lots of shots of vodka. Whilst the battle itself had seen a great deal of contact between the American soldiers and the German civilians of Leipzig, the occupation laws explicitly prohibited fraternization with the locals. But whatever the official policy, the reality on the ground was far more fluid, with American GIs regularly coming into contact with the people of Leipzig. This happened especially in the vicinity of the Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, where a burgeoning black market operated. In the clandestine market, the American soldiers gladly sold their surplus packets of cigarettes, chewing gum, and chocolate to the Germans. This black market was obviously illegal, but it seems to have been tolerated, with MPs only turning up on a handful of occasions to arrest a few people involved in the illicit trade. One thing which also stands out from the diary entries and reports of the American occupation is that the civilian population of Leipzig were not subjected to widespread abuse by American troops. Yes, American soldiers were certainly guilty of looting rings, watches, and other personal items from defeated Wehrmacht soldiers. But it seems these crimes rarely happened to the people of Leipzig. Of course, one can never claim with full certainty that no abuses ever occurred to the civilians. But, simply put, the American occupation of Leipzig was nothing like the experience civilians suffered in other defeated German cities, particularly cities like Berlin. In Berlin, Red Army soldiers unleashed a wave of violence on the people, and they looted almost everything that wasn't nailed down. In contrast, the people of Leipzig were not subjected to a mass campaign of terror from the American forces. However, whilst the people may have been largely untouched by their new occupiers, the Americans did happily strip the remaining industrial and scientific wealth from Leipzig. Aircraft production factories, armaments industries, and even the laboratories of the university were all minutely catalogued by the Americans, with the most valuable equipment carted off to the West. Blueprints, inventions, experimental weapons and vehicles were of most importance to the Americans, but they also spirited away scientists, technicians, and experts. The Americans were determined to take some of Leipzig's cultural wealth as well, and notable publishing houses had their operations in Leipzig wound up and transferred in a large American military convoy to the west. But why were the Americans hurriedly removing Leipzig's industrial, scientific, and cultural treasures? Well, that was because the Americans knew the clock was ticking on their occupation of the city. Thus, they were keen to remove anything of importance before they handed Leipzig over to the Soviets. Despite this, life under the Americans seemed to continue as normal. And in late June, the Americans even requested that the mayor, Dr. Fehrling, assemble a new city council, which was to be modelled on Leipzig's last democratically elected council from 1932. This council was entrusted with overseeing all civil administrative efforts until the people of Leipzig could elect a new democratic city parliament. And with the introduction of this new governing body, it seemed as if the American military authorities were taking concrete steps to usher in a new democratic age in the city. However, whilst the Americans were supposedly busy promoting the onset of democracy in Leipzig, they were also preparing to leave. And their campaign of removing the scientific elite from the city increased apace, with more than 40 senior scientific researchers from the university transported out of Leipzig on the 22nd and 23rd of June alone. Whilst the Americans prepared themselves for the impending handover to the Soviets, the people of Leipzig carried on with their lives, blissfully unaware of what was in store for them. The Americans and the Soviets set the 1st of July as the agreed-upon handover date for Leipzig. But this was not announced to the people of Leipzig. For the entirety of the American occupation, Leipzigers had consoled themselves that whilst they had lost the war and suffered tremendously both in terms of loss of life and physical damage, their hardship had at least resulted in an occupation by the Americans. This surely meant that their city would be firmly anchored in the Western democratic world, and that the people would not be forced to live under the oppressive Soviet regime. Alas, this was not to be the case. On the morning of the 1st of July, the people of Leipzig woke up to the unthinkable. The Americans were packing up their equipment and headquarters. They climbed into their trucks and jeeps, and they left Leipzig, heading west. The people then waited with bated breath, fearing the worst. Later that day, Soviet forces crossed the Elbe and Mulde rivers, and by the 2nd of July, the first Red Army units had entered Leipzig. When American forces had first entered Leipzig in April, they had arrived in all kinds of motorized vehicles, including trucks, tanks, jeeps, and even motorbikes. In contrast, when the Red Army turned up, they advanced into Leipzig in a long column of mainly horse-drawn carriages. This left a lasting impression on the people of Leipzig, and it gave them the first indication that they were in for a very different type of occupation. Local resident Klaus Barth described his feelings upon seeing the new Soviet occupiers. "I will never forget how the Russian army entered Leipzig. Instinctively, I felt afraid. They came with horse-drawn carts, tanks, field guns, and many soldiers on foot. Visually, they looked very different from the Americans. They were mostly wrapped in blankets, wearing rough boots. Not exactly the appearance of a victorious army. I had a sense that nothing good was coming, and it was just as I feared. The Russians had nothing to eat, and neither did we. There were frequent reports of rapes. Fortunately, our family wasn't affected. The consequence? You avoided every Russian you saw. This would remain the case for a long time." General Major Nikolai Trufanov arrived as the new Red Army commander of Leipzig, and he immediately started rolling back the administrative and political changes which the Americans had introduced to the city. The Red Army bypassed the civil administration and the Leipzig mayor Dr. Vierling, and instead negotiated directly with NKFD members to introduce a new pro-communist system of governance in Leipzig. Whilst the Leipzig communists welcomed the Red Army into the city, the majority of the population viewed the change in occupiers with skepticism, and they feared widespread acts of violence from the Soviets. A new curfew was issued in the city, prohibiting any German civilian from leaving their home between 11 p.m. and 4:30 a.m. Anyone who violated this curfew was punished severely, with Soviet troops authorized to use their weapons to enforce the curfew. Within hours, the Leipzig police chief Heinrich Fleissner was dismissed from his post. And on the 16th of July, Dr. Vierling was replaced as mayor by the former Social Democrat Erich Zeigner. If you remember, at the end of the Battle of Leipzig, the Americans had first approached Zeigner to become mayor, but he had turned them down. However, With the Soviets now in charge of Leipzig, Seigner had a change of heart. Seigner was a social democrat, but he had long advocated for close cooperation between the Social Democrats and the Communists. For the Soviets, appointing a communist mayor would have been too obvious. So selecting a bourgeois social democrat for the role, like Erich Seigner, upheld the pretense that the new occupiers weren't going to force communism on the people. In reality, the true power lay with the communists, with the deputy mayoralty and other key roles within the personnel and education departments, along with the police force, being occupied by communists. Just as the Americans had done, the new Soviet authorities established an investigative unit called the Commissariat for Special Tasks, which was primarily focused on tracking down Nazi war criminals. However, unlike the Americans, the Commissariat for Special Tasks broadened the scope of their investigations, because whilst they did hunt for high-level Nazis, they also targeted democratic opponents of the new communist-approved regime. The Soviet NKVD also quickly established their own prison on Alfred Kästner Strasse, where they rounded up and interrogated political opponents of the communists. But what they couldn't achieve through legal persecution, they were more than happy to achieve through other more covert means. For instance, a smear campaign quickly arose targeting the recently dismissed police chief Heinrich Fleißner, with the aim of ensuring the man never returned to public life. Eventually, even Dr. Fehrling, the former mayor, would fall victim to a denazification tribunal, which revoked his notary and legal qualifications. Fehrling fought this decision through the courts, but it took years for the decision to be overturned and for him to be rehabilitated. Even though the Americans had stripped Leipzig of many of its industrial capacities, along with many of its brightest scientists and technicians, there was still plenty left for the Soviets to pick their way through during their occupation. The Soviets were extremely thorough in their efforts to dismantle the economic and industrial prowess of Leipzig, with the electricity works and 35 large factories being completely dismantled. Leipzig's cultural sites also suffered from the new confiscations and reparations imposed by the Soviet military administration. For example, Leipzig Zoo was forced to hand over many of its animals to Kyiv Zoo in Ukraine. Plus, art objects and valuable books were confiscated from museums and libraries, and they were sent to Russia. The people of Leipzig could do nothing about the plundering of their city, as the Soviet military authorities issued a decree in December 1945, stating that any opposition or resistance to the dismantling of industries for the goal of reparations would be classed as acts of diversion and sabotage. The penalties for these acts of opposition could be as high as 15 years in prison, or even the death penalty. Despite the economic plundering of Leipzig, the thing the people feared the most was the prospect of physical and sexual violence, which they knew had occurred in other Soviet-occupied cities in Germany. In many ways, Leipzig was lucky in that the Red Army only entered the city in early July, almost 2 months after the end of the war. This meant that the feelings of euphoria and revenge, which helped fuel the horrific violence meted out on German civilians in places like Berlin, at the end of the war were less intense by the time the Soviets arrived in Leipzig. That said, the people of Leipzig nevertheless reported a marked change in the attitudes of the occupation forces. Because whilst the Americans had largely treated the German civilians with respect, and instances of violence and sexual assault were almost unheard of, this atmosphere changed completely when the Soviets took control in July. And from then on, first-hand accounts from Leipzigers started popping up, describing how Red Army troops were targeting young women for rape, with German civilians who tried to stand in the way being shot dead. Stories of drunken Russian soldiers mishandling and threatening civilians were also common. However, there are no concrete numbers regarding the abuse of civilians in Leipzig from Red Army troops, so getting a full picture of these crimes is difficult. In any case, even if the people of Leipzig suffered less violence than their compatriots in Berlin, they still suffered in other ways. For example, the lack of food, clean running water, and disrupted heating and electricity services all helped contribute to an outbreak of dysentery, typhus, and diphtheria, which ravaged Leipzig in the winter of 1945 to 1946. As the Soviet hold on Leipzig tightened, the authorities renamed numerous streets and squares to mark the transition from Leipzig's fascist past to its new communist future. The Soviets also introduced new public holidays to the city, which honored the communist cause. For instance, the anniversary of the Russian Communist Revolution was celebrated in Leipzig in November 1945. All public squares and buildings in the city were adorned with decorations for the occasion, and festive lighting was erected in the city centre, despite the ongoing difficulties the Soviets faced with providing stable electricity and gas supplies. Priorities, hey? The new mayor, Erich Zeigner, followed the wishes of his new Soviet overlords, and he supported the merger of the Leipzig Social Democrat and Communist parties in a special conference which took place at the Felsenkeller Brewery in Leipzig in May 1946. This brewery had been the site of the Panzerfaust ambush, which knocked out a Sherman tank and killed 5 American soldiers during the Battle of Leipzig. In April 1949, Erich Zeigner died, and he was replaced as mayor by a communist. With this last act, the communist takeover of Leipzig was complete, a control they would not relinquish until 1990. During the times of the German Democratic Republic, or the DDR in German, little was said in school lessons about the American assault on Leipzig and their subsequent occupation of the city. And the achievements of the first post-war mayor, Dr. Vierling, and the efforts made by the Americans to stabilize the post-war chaos in Leipzig went overlooked and ignored. As a result, many Leipzig residents believed that the first post-war mayor of their city was the Soviet-appointed Erich Zeigner. Yes, school textbooks did mention that American forces were responsible for liberating large swathes of Thüringen, Sachsen-Anhalt, and Saxony. But all history teachers were instructed to follow up with the explanation that whilst the assistance of the Western Allies in defeating fascism was appreciated, True liberation only took place with the arrival of the Red Army, because from then on the anti-fascists were given the opportunity to build a truly new life for the people of Leipzig. The details of the Battle of Leipzig and the specific locations which were heavily involved in the fighting were glossed over during DDR times, or the locations were co-opted to serve the regime's new version of history. For example, the building at Dietrichring 24, which had functioned as the first headquarters for the American military administration of Leipzig in April 1945, was in 1950 transformed into the new headquarters for the Stasi. And from this building, the Stasi spent the next 40 years surveilling and persecuting the people of Leipzig. The building's prior history of hosting the American military headquarters was completely ignored, and it's only in recent years that a plaque was installed on the exterior of the building telling passers-by about the building's important role at the end of the war. Meanwhile, the building on Jahn-Allee 61 and its famous connection with the Robert Capa photographs of the killing of Private Bowman also went unrecognized by the DDR regime. The house was eventually abandoned, and it lay derelict for years. On New Year's Eve 2011-2012, a fire ripped through the empty building, after which the city planned to demolish the site. However, motivated by the historical importance of the house, a citizens' initiative was formed, and they saved the building from the bulldozers. In 2016, an exhibition space was opened on the ground floor of the building, giving visitors an insight into the Battle of Leipzig, whilst also telling the story of Private Bowman, Robert Capa, and the iconic photo which was taken in the flat on the second floor. Today, the house is informally known to the people of Leipzig as Capa House. In a fitting tribute, the exhibition opening in 2016 was attended by a then 96-year-old Lehman Riggs, the soldier who served in Bowman's machine gun platoon and who was in the flat during Bowman's final moments. During the same 2016 ceremony, the street adjacent to the house on Jahn-Allee 61 was renamed Bowmanstrasse, and just opposite lies Kappa-Strasse. The victims from the Tekla concentration camp massacre were commemorated during DDR times, and a huge memorial obelisk was constructed in 1958 on Tekla Strasse, near the site of the killings. In 2018, the city of Leipzig unveiled a new memorial installation at the site, upon which all of the known names of the victims were engraved. And even now, more than 80 years on from the killings, the massacre is still commemorated annually in the city. But no other location in Leipzig best represents the city's complicated relationship with the Battle of Leipzig than the Völkerschlacht Denkmal. This monument played host to some of the most significant fighting in April 1945, and the surrender of Colonel von Pontsit and his men on the 20th of April formally signalled the last act of the battle. This story, however, was brushed over by the DDR regime, who instead utilised the Völkerschlacht Denkmal for their own propaganda purposes, just as the Nazis had done before them. Of course, the communists couldn't praise the themes of German nationalism, so they had to get more inventive, and they instead portrayed the monument as a symbol of German-Russian solidarity. Because German and Russian soldiers had fought side by side during the Battle of the Nations against Napoleon in 1813. This was quite the narrative stretch, but it gave the DDR regime all the pretense it needed to host huge torch-lit parades at the monument, which were attended by legions of schoolchildren, party members, and soldiers. In preparing this series on the Battle of Leipzig, I used a variety of books and online journals, which are detailed in the show notes. But I just wanted to give a special mention to the historian Jürgen Möller, whose excellent book Die letzte Schlacht, Leipzig 1945, provided a fascinating amount of minute details about the fighting in and around Leipzig. And to get a better understanding of what the people of Leipzig experienced during the American and Soviet occupations, I used the book from Manfred Ungern-Sternberg, and I also relied on a number of articles from the Leipziger Volkszeitung. Lastly, I also want to draw attention to the fantastic work of the Kappa Culture Group, who do a brilliant job at running the Kappa House exhibition in Leipzig. They make sure future generations know the story of Private Bowman and Robert Kappa's photo of the last man to die. Nowadays, Leipzig is a city reborn, and its fully renovated centre is full of modern art galleries and department stores, sitting neatly beside lovingly restored facades of historical buildings. As a result of the renovations, there are shockingly few bullet holes or shrapnel damage from the Battle of Leipzig to be found within the city centre, which is astonishing given the amount of damage which buildings such as the Hauptbahnhof and the Neues Rathaus suffered. Even here, a close inspection of the facade of the Neues Rathaus shows that the damage has been paved over or filled in with plaster. The best place in Leipzig to see battle damage from April 1945 is the Völkerschlacht-Denkmal. Here, despite a few renovations over the years, there are still literally hundreds of bullet holes and shrapnel scars to be found, along with shell impact craters inside the building, which have obviously been patched up with new brickwork. That said, if you visit the monument, then don't be surprised by the fact that the main focus is put on the 1813 Napoleonic battle, not the fighting in April 1945. I think this is a shame, but of course, given Germany's history, you can't blame the country for wanting to highlight the more successful and heroic stories from its past, rather than its most shameful ones. In that case, it's left to podcasts such as this to tell the story of what happened in Leipzig at the end of the Second World War. I'm David Sumner, and that was the Battle of Leipzig. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.